Hello, welcome to today's webinar. We are happy to have you with us for this Getting to Zero session, Grid Integrated Buildings. I am Connie Umphris, Communications Manager here at New Buildings Institute. Quick acknowledgement of the sponsors you see here. Their support of this webinar series provides ongoing opportunities for knowledge sharing around actionable solutions to drive the highest levels of efficiency in buildings. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know and we will help you as we go. We will take a few questions at the end of the presentation. Please ask questions in the same question pane. Please take a moment to answer the survey at the end of the webinar. We consider your input in the planning of future sessions. If you are seeking AIA credits, the survey is where you will share your AIA number for credit submission. The session is being recorded. All registrants will receive an email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for the session. If you need a certificate of attendance for your records, it will also be part of tomorrow's follow-up. Here is today's panel in order of speakers. We have my colleague Alexi Miller leading off the session today. Alexi, over to you.
Thank you, Connie. So I would like to welcome everybody to the webinar today. Thank you for joining, for spending your time with us. We're going to give you a little overview on a couple of grid integrated building topics at different scales. I want to give a quick introduction to New Buildings Institute. We are a nonprofit organization more than 20 years old, and we are focused on three basic program areas: building and program innovation, zero energy leadership and market development, and advancing codes and policy. And our work on building grid integration sort of touches on all three of those. Of course, building and program innovation in large part, but this is an area of growing focus for us and for a lot of the country, as we see some pretty significant energy transitions at various scales across the system. So I wanted to introduce our panel today. You'll hear from me a bit later on, but first we're going to hear from Rushil Desai, who's a senior building analyst at Elemental Engineering, Rose Langmuir, senior research engineer at National Renewable Energy Lab, and Victor Olcay, a principal at RMI. And without further ado, Rushil, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexi. Hi, everyone. I'm Rushil Desai, a senior building performance analyst at Elemental Engineering, which is the New York branch of Integral Group. I'm a part of the design analytics practice with a heavy focus on advancing decarbonization in the built environment. We're here today to talk about grid integrated buildings, and what I want to specifically talk about what that means and why we're having this discussion from the point of view of a practitioner in the AC industry. Historically, we've focused on deterministic models, energy models, if you will, of buildings in isolation. And what that means is we've focused on building energy efficiency for a very long time, for good reason, because buildings have historically contributed to a significant extent in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions. More recently, we've started expanding our boundaries conditions in order to completely and fully appreciate the context in which we're designing these buildings. And we're starting to look beyond just the building itself, because there's more to building emissions than just the building in itself. And as we move forward, the targets that we've set ourselves in terms of decarbonization over the next couple of decades have kind of compelled us to reimagine that context. We don't exactly know what the future grid is going to look like, so we're starting to expand our boundary conditions even further so that we can design our buildings more holistically. And the first project that I want to talk about as a part of this is based in New York, and sometimes these conversations on expanding these boundary conditions are prompted by policy. In this case, by Local Law 97, which is if you're not familiar with it, it's New York legislation that sets absolute emission targets for building types for 2024 to 2030 and 2030 to 2040. And the 2024 targets require a certain portion of the building stock to evaluate its emissions. And as the years go by, the targets get progressively harder. And just this shift in conversation from energy code or relative energy or energy cost savings to absolute emissions has in a way broadened the scope of what it means to be designing a high performance building. And the project that I want to focus on is an airport terminal in New York. And from the outset of the project itself, we realized that we can't just focus on the project boundary itself. We need to start looking at where the energy is coming from. And that doesn't just mean the gas-fired fire district energy system, but also all the way back to the grid itself. And the way our workflow was configured is we started off thinking about it in a traditional way, which is focusing on building efficiency, envelope performance, internal loads, HVAC systems. At some point, we start to realize that the building energy use is heavily driven by the program, and we transition from breaking it down into energy end uses into fuel types. Right from the get-go, it's easy to identify that we need to reduce our reliance on the inefficient district energy system. So the next logical step in this case is to consider a cogeneration upgrade. So instead of relying on an inefficient existing trigeneration system for chilled water and hot water, we're now shifting to a more efficient cogeneration facility. And you can tell right here that this already does get us closer to our 2024 local law 97 targets, but we're nowhere near our 2030 targets. And that's basically, there's an underlying assumption here that as the grid gets cleaner, the electricity associated with the project gets cleaner. But in this case, switching over to on-site cogeneration doesn't really help because natural gas doesn't really change over the course of 10 years. So the reliance on natural gas kind of weighs us down in some sense. And I guess that's the perfect segue for us to have a conversation about switching over to electrification, an all-electric plant. The first step that we take is to kind of minimize the electricity use for the building, which is to kind of address some of the process loads, and then to eliminate reliance on and the inefficient district chilled water by adopting supplementary electric chillers. And this already gets us to meet our 2024 targets and also gets us very close to our 2030 targets. To kind of summarize our approach until now, we've currently focused on building efficiency and the plant configuration, which is to figure out where we're sourcing our chilled water and hot water from. But now it's kind of imperative to look beyond these typical project boundaries to ensure we meet these absolute targets. And the reason we have to do that is a lot of this analysis rides on the premise that the grid will get cleaner. So when we start looking at what that means, when we start looking at the context of the grid, we thought of developing a prioritization plan in the form of a sensitivity analysis of the project's ability to meet these targets to the rate at which the grid gets cleaner. So what we've presented in the graph is on the x-axis, I have the rate at which the grid gets cleaner as a percentage reduction over 2024 factors. And on the y-axis, I have required renewable energy offset to be able to meet these targets in 2030. And what this allows us to show is it basically shows us all of the alternatives on a single graph in the form of a trade-off. We either design a system that is the least sensitive to the future of the grid, and that kind of allows us to under-design on-site PV or not have to rely on renewable energy credits as much in the future, or we under-design the system and take a risk based on how clean we think the grid is going to be in the future, and then rely on on-site PV or RECs. And generally, these are all good options, but instead of a deterministic single number, we're presenting it in the form of a sensitivity analysis so that we can design to minimize the uncertainty with what the future is going to look like. And to kind of summarize what our approach on this project, what we kind of learned is designing a high performance building is more than just designing an efficient building. It's thinking beyond about the source of where that energy is coming from, whether it's about plant infrastructure or grid infrastructure. And this project was mainly concerned about static absolute emission factors. It didn't really account for the fact that grid emissions are also have a time of use component. The next project that I'm going to talk about has a significant time of use component. The goal of the project was to address greenhouse gas emissions associated with the building. And what I mean by time of use is, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the duck curve. But what I mean by that is greenhouse gas emissions depend on not just how much energy is drawn from the grid, but also when that energy is drawn from the grid. And that kind of is portrayed in the marginal emissions profile that we see here, which is the gray dotted line for 2020. And as renewable energy penetration increases even further, that time of use component gets even more pronounced because the grid starts getting saturated, and which is shown by the dotted black line for 2030. And at the start of this project, we start with a PV system that offsets 24% of the energy use of the project. But because of that time of use component that we were talking about, the GHG avoidance is just 12% because most of the energy that's offset is during hours of cleaner emissions as opposed to dirtier emissions from the grid. And in 2030, because that profile is even more exaggerated, the GHG avoidance drops to just 6%. And this kind of goes to say that generation, as when we're talking about future emission avoidance, just generation is not enough. We need to also talk about shifting the load curve. And to address this, we developed an automated dispatch logic for a reasonably sized battery that tracks the GHG emissions profile so that we can charge and discharge the battery in a way that we can shift the load curve to minimize, to maximize GHG avoidance. And the way that pans out is for the same PV system, with just the addition of a battery bank, we have 24% energy savings and 18% GHG avoidance in 2020, and that goes up from 12% in the previous case. The real impact of this is seen in 2030 when the GHG avoidance increases fivefold from 6% to 32%. And again, that's because the grid emission intensity profile gets a lot more exaggerated, and the time of use component associated with the grid emissions is a lot more important as we go along a decade later. And again, to summarize, this is kind of represented again in the form of a sensitivity analysis because we're trying to move away from deterministic numbers. But to kind of summarize what this means is this 24% talks about the baseline energy savings that result from on-site PV. With no battery, that results in 12% GHG avoidance in 2020, which drops to 6% in 2030. With just a 2 megawatt battery, that increases to 32% in 2030. And the reason we're doing this sensitivity is we're trying to figure out what the appropriate battery size is. With a 4 megawatt battery, GHG avoidance increases to 48% in 2030, which doesn't mean that we need to have a 4 megawatt battery from day one. All it means is this is an important conversation to have as we figure out a way to phase in battery capacity over the next couple of years to maximize the GHG avoidance potential of the project. And both of these projects focused essentially on building efficiency, on-site renewables and storage, dispatch optimization. that doesn't mean that we haven't on those two projects focused on another very important aspect of this, which is load management and uncertainty of what the future of the grid is going to look like. For practitioners like us, it really opens up the conversation to a wide range of topics, including rate structure optimization, designing for resilience, thermal survivability. It kind of moves us away from deterministic models into probabilistic models, which essentially helps us helps us completely understand the full range of possibilities so that we can more holistically design a grid integrated building in its true sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Rushil. Appreciate that. It's really interesting. Connie, if there are any clarifying questions, we can take them now. Otherwise, we'll jump to Rose.
None yet.
All right, Rose.
Great, thank you, Alexi, and hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. I'm Rose Langner. I'm an architectural engineer and senior researcher in the Communities and Urban Science Research Group at NREL, which is under our Building Technologies and Science Center. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the value of GEB to various stakeholders. I'll do this by referencing an example of the value of GEB to a particular portfolio of buildings. I'm referencing a portfolio analysis study of the General Services Administration, or GSA's portfolio of buildings that was conducted by the Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI. And then I'd also like to spend some time just briefly to talk about some GEB software solutions that we are currently testing in real buildings, so some field demonstrations. And this project has aims to really quantify the impact of load flexibility on energy demand and carbon emissions. So big picture, let me just step back a second and we can talk about why GEB is important. GEB is Grid Interact Efficient Buildings, otherwise known as GEB, is all about enabling buildings to provide this flexibility in energy use and grid operations. So in our country, in the US, 75% of electricity generation is used in our buildings. And for many years now, decades even, we have talked about this notion of a smart grid. And I really think that it hasn't been until now where we can really start to accomplish this idea and this notion of a smart grid. We have the technology, we have connected devices, connected equipment, we have advanced analytics that we can really utilize. We have sensors and controls that we can have this better communication between different pieces of equipment within individual buildings, and then connect that the buildings to the grid through a lot of the communication protocols that have been developed for two-way communication. So now is the time. I'm going to take a sip of water here. Hold on. Okay, excuse me. Had a tickle in my throat. So talking about the benefits, this slide really outlines at a high level how flexible building loads can benefit multiple stakeholders. So first and foremost, energy affordability, especially in the commercial sector. A lot of commercial buildings experience very high demand charges. So if we can be more flexible on when we can use our energy, we can greatly reduce those demand charges. I've seen demand charges on some buildings, you know, up to 2/3 of their utility costs, and I think that can even be greater for certain buildings. So there's an enormous opportunity here to reduce our energy costs. By coordinating better and optimizing energy use with the grid, we can of course improve the reliability and resiliency of the grid and reduce grid congestion. There's enhanced services, not only as the building providing enhanced services to the utility, but the utility has this opportunity to provide enhanced services back to the building through incentive programs, et cetera, that they might offer. As Rushil was mentioning too, there's this great opportunity also to increase our environmental benefits, reduce our carbon impact through this. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but when we have these peak demand times, we have these more polluting and expensive peaker plants to come meet that additional load that the baseload plants can't manage. We are emitting a lot more carbon into our atmosphere. So if we can avoid those peaker plants from operating, we'll see a great number of environmental benefits. In addition, if we're optimizing the operation of the building, we can really look at optimizing it also for the occupants, so improving the indoor environmental quality of a building. And lastly, customer choice. With this flexibility, building owners have the option to decide when they really want to rely on the grid or when they can back off. So there's a lot of flexibility in how a building owner, facility manager can run and operate these buildings to really meet their needs. So quickly, the Department of Energy has characterized GEBs in these as having these 4 components, these 4 characteristics. First and foremost, grid interactive efficient buildings. We want to make sure that efficiency is the underlying factor here, that we're persistent in promoting low energy in our buildings, that we're minimizing the demand on grid resources and infrastructure. Secondly, as I mentioned, we're now in this technological phase of life where we have a lot of connectivity, we have IoT devices, we have communication protocols that enable this two-way communication between technologies, between the building and the grid, and even to collect occupant feedback on operation so that we can really optimize how our buildings are being used and operated. Smart, we are also of an age of big data. So we've really come a long way with advanced analytics that are supported by sensors and controls. And we can use all of that to co-optimize the efficiency, flexibility, and occupant preferences. And lastly, when we combine all this and we can be flexible in when we actually use our energy, reduce or shift load at very specific times of the day, leverage our generation and our storage sources, then we can really co-optimize how we work with the grid for cost, for emissions, for comfort, etc. This slide, I won't go through it in depth, but it just outlines this multiple stakeholders and the multiple sources of value that really see when we push towards grid interactive efficient buildings. And so for the rest of my talk today, I really want to focus on the economic value of GEB to owners and grid stakeholders, and also the carbon value to society. So as I mentioned, the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, had conducted an extensive energy modeling analysis on GSA's portfolio buildings to quantify the significant untapped value that GSA could unlock by investing in GEBs. For those who don't know, GSA manages over 354 million square feet of federal space in 8,600 buildings across the nation. So they are, massive landlords for the federal government here. The GEB measures that they explored in this energy modeling analysis were all proven measures, but they go beyond today's energy management best practices and focus on demand and the time value of energy through efficiency, renewable energy, energy storage, and load flexible technologies. The analysis shows that by using these proven measures, GSA can realize substantial energy and demand impacts that are cost effective, for example, paybacks of less than 4 years, with sizable savings at scale. So this slide really speaks to the benefits to these different stakeholders. In regards to direct benefits to GSA, the portfolio owner, they could see $50 million in annual cost savings, which is about 20% of the GSA annual energy spend. This would require $184 million of upfront investment that would in turn deliver $206 million in net present value over 8 years. And also investing in GEB. So this really can help future-proof the GSA portfolio, especially as future utility rates are likely to change and more utilities are offering time of use rate structures, et cetera. So it's really, this is planning for what's coming down pipeline in the future. Really important investments monetarily and also in thinking about what's happening down pipeline here. For grid and societal values, these include reducing grid level transmission and distribution generation costs. And this reduces it up to about $70 million per year, which is what the study found, which ultimately benefits government and taxpayers. And there's a number of indirect values to GSA, including leadership amongst the commercial real estate community, enabling deeper savings through performance contracts, better building control to improve comfort, health, and productivity, and of course a reduction in carbon emissions, which of course is very prominent, and especially for GSA right now with this new administration's very aggressive carbon reduction goals. So I just want to highlight some of the strategies that were looked at and which ones were most effective. So let's look at the measures first. So cost effective in almost every location. They found LED lighting upgrades, which includes tube retrofits, fixture retrofits, the staging of certain equipment to reduce peak demand. So what that means is you're not running all of the equipment at the same time. So staging it in its operation. So that included laptop battery charging, air handling unit fans, especially when it relates to occupancy in a building, electric resistance heaters in all electric buildings. And then lastly, kind of a low-hanging fruit was space temperature setbacks to reduce peak demand. In some locations, it was also really cost-effective to look at advanced lighting controls, where you could actually dim lights to an unperceivable level, but find savings there to enable peak shaving and response to specific DR, demand response events. And then of course, electric battery storage is cost effective in some locations, and solar PV, and a bundle of those two, where you can enhance the value by bundling them together. The strategies as well, I think this first one makes a lot of sense. Of course, the best returns are in those locations with very high demand charges that have time of use rates and seasonal variation. And then secondly, I think this was a key outcome of this project, was really recognizing that consistent demand management or continuous demand management really delivered greater value than just responding to utility-driven peak demand or demand response events. So, you know, I take that one to heart, especially as a building scientist at NREL, that we really need to focus on continually managing our demand and understanding where those opportunities are. Let's see, this is trying to advance the slide. There we go. So this next slide here is really looking at the carbon value of this analysis. The analysis showed that demand flexibility can cut building demand by 30 to 50%, and that really attributes to this idea of, you know, 80% of the grid peak demand is driven by buildings, and if we can reduce the need for these peaker plants, these marginal plants that come on once the baseload capacity that these utilities are operating at it has been exceeded, we can really cut our carbon emissions. These peaker plants are often much dirtier, more expensive to operate, and if we can avoid having those peaker plants being run, that's where our real impact is going to be on the carbon side. So there's just a tremendous opportunity and tremendous amount of value for us to reduce our carbon emissions here. And diving into the peaker plants a little bit more, just to emphasize this, you know, the peaker plants are expensive, they're low efficacy, they cost up to 1,300% more than other typical resources. So this is why when you're operating your building during peak demand times, you're going to see major peak demand charges on your utility bill. They are heavy polluters, so there's a lot of health impacts to that. And there's also an inequitable lens to this as well, as it often impacts low-income and communities of color. They are often closer to these areas, and they disproportionately bear the brunt of peaker plant health concerns. As the slide said, in these high impacted areas, rates are 4 times higher for ozone attributable asthma admissions. So that's a pretty significant inequity there. On the horizon, NREL is actually working with RMI. RMI is expanding this analysis to look at applying a similar gap value analysis methodology to 2 additional commercial building portfolios that we've selected through the Better Buildings Alliance. We are working with a big box retail partner and then also a multifamily partner. We are getting close to being able to wrap up results and put them into reports. So I expect by the end of September, we'll have results that are more public facing. So stay tuned for that. I'll talk briefly about these pilot projects looking at GEB software solutions in buildings in a moment here. I want to mention that RMI is working with NYSERDA to explore the carbon value of demand flexibility and implications on their local law 97, which aims to mitigate the effects of greenhouse gas emissions from buildings. Grid Optimal Buildings Initiative, I'm sure Alexi will get to this, but this has, you know, metrics and best practices for around GEB from pilot projects, so I'll let Alexi explain that. And then also, just to put on your radar, Department of Energy had released a very large funding opportunity for connected communities. So I know they're in the process of reviewing applications to that and down selecting, but I think there's going to be a lot of really interesting information coming out of those pilot projects looking at how do we expand GAB from one building but to a multitude of buildings, and what's the impact of that operation. So really quickly, I know I'm probably out of time, but I want to talk about these GAB field studies. This is through a joint RFI that GSA and Department of Energy release through their GSA Proving Ground and DOE High Impact Technology Catalyst programs. We had a request for information go out in 2019 for basically GEB software solutions that could enable multiple load flexibility modes and control multiple building loads in a building. So pretty complicated software technologies. Whoops, I skipped over a slide here. So we ended up selecting 5 software solutions. There are 4 national laboratories that are going to lead the measurement and verification of testing these in real buildings. They'll be tested in both federal GSA buildings and non-federal buildings. Oh, I keep skipping slides here. And just objectives for this is the first time we're really going into a real building and quantifying the impact of GAB measures in a real building. So we're looking at what are the capabilities of the software to enable efficiency and load flexibility continuously and in response to specific DR events. What's the total cost? What's the benefits to the owner and the utility? You know, how complex are these solutions? How do we integrate it? So there's just going to be a lot of information that comes out of these studies that I think will be really interesting and impactful to the general public when they want to implement these solutions on their own. We did spend a lot of time thinking about what are these major main metrics around demand flexibility, and it's actually much more complicated than the metrics we think about for just energy efficiency in itself, because there's so much time dependence and seasonal dependence, locational dependence on how these are impact a building. And just as outcomes for this, we will have public facing reports. We're probably a year and a half out from anything that we will be releasing, but we'll do a number of presentations. We'll share the quantitative and qualitative success metrics that were calculated there, and also very importantly, capturing lessons learned and best practices from each field study. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and look forward to your questions later.
We had one quick question for you, Rose. Could you give us the definition again for GEB?
Absolutely, and I apologize. This is a term that I've been using extensively throughout this. I think we all have. GEB, it actually stands for Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings. So it's this notion that buildings are not only efficient, but they offer flexibility in how they use their energy.
Thank you. And that's it for clarifying questions at this time.
Thanks, Connie. Victor?
Well, hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. And yeah, I'm with Rose on this GEB idea here. It's a really unfortunate acronym, I think. Somehow, if we had been able to come up with something more clever and gotten it socialized more quickly, we could have something that was a bit more intuitive. GEB somehow seems like something, I don't know, that you don't want to have around, but I think we do. So anyway, thank you everybody for being here. I'm excited to follow these two great speakers. It really kind of makes my job a lot easier, and having Alexi kind of pull it up at the end, there's just a lot of great information here. But I'll like to kind of bring it up a scale a little bit and think about kind of grid interactive buildings at a larger scale, and show you a few examples of some projects we've worked on and ones that are going on. And it's a really exciting time, frankly, to be thinking about this. And if you've spent a lot of time in the last year inside your house looking out, like I have, it's a great opportunity to sort of imagine what's going on out there. Outside my window, I can see lots of buildings, lots of individual buildings that that aren't really connected together, and I kind of wonder about that. You know, I think, is there really is this the neighborhood that we want? Is this the sort of relationship of buildings and streets and so forth that we want? And by the way, I'm not a cat. I'm just going to let you know that but yeah, I still do have these questions. And let me see. If we do think about those connections between buildings, what are they? And the connections between each other, and the connections between ourselves and the exterior environment. It's kind of an interesting moment, because we, at least at RMI, we've always talked about how if energy was a little bit more visible, then people would pay more attention to it. But it's kind of something that's sort of like in the background, and you don't really have necessarily a great image of what's happening in your buildings, you know, except for their utility bill or feeling hot or cold or something. But these connections, and as Rand Charles Eames said, it's the quality of the connections that actually gives you kind of this, that's what's desired, right? It's giving you kind of a better life. And I think that now that we're starting to think about how buildings are connected to utilities and how buildings are connected to each other, we can start to optimize those connections and understand how we can understand those interactions. And I guess one thing that I can add from the previous presentations is that all these things are going on, and a lot of them are invisible, and they're not synchronized. So a lot of our concerns for one quality of interaction may not be happening at the same time as a need for another one. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of go on here. So we're really good at building energy efficient buildings. NBI has been doing these great kind of lists of how many net zero buildings are out there. This happens to be actually RMI's Boulder's offices in Boulder Common, net zero building, but it's really not very well connected to everything else that's going on around us, right? It's sort of net zero by itself in a way. And of course, that's not where we need to go. We need to be thinking much more deeply about this and sort of start to understand, how that affects utilities. And most people, I think, have been exposed to the duct curve. You gotta sort of love the ducts. The ducts, are wonderful, and of course, the curves that they create are not necessarily as perfect. We've got situations where we have really expensive electricity when we go from having too much renewable energy or a lot of renewable energy that creates a low spot, and you have to ramp down, and then the utility plants have to ramp up, and so that's a problem. And our buildings can actually start to alleviate that by sort of flattening out the grid and making the utilities work a little bit better, as has already been described by others. And just this idea of actually kind of changing the shape of those load curves is kind of an exciting thing, that your buildings can actually have that impact on this larger infrastructure. So as we've kind of talked about, this can be something that's has financial benefits to building owners. It can help the grid run better. It can reduce pollution. What I would say though is these, as I started to say earlier, they happen at different times, right? I mean, so here's an example of how those marginal emissions vary over months and years, and this is in California. But and where the green is showing you a lower carbon intensity on the grid, as opposed to areas that are bright red, and those are what you would like to avoid in terms of your carbon emissions, right? You'd like to not be using electricity when it has the most carbon intensity. But that may or may not align with cost, for example, or it may or may not align with your ability to store, or it may not align with the building use or other sorts of things. So there's a lot of variability and overlay in terms of schedule and sort of these criteria that we want to have. So it's interesting. But what's really kind of great is this company, Watt Time, and I'm not promoting them per se, but we can see this in real time now. So we are in that position of being able to start to visualize and understand energy and carbon intensity and all of these costs and things much better than we have in the past. So it's an interesting moment to see how that may shape our buildings going forward. So connecting these communities together, we're concerned about them being interactive and efficient. We're interested in how they work with the grid services that are out there. How can we actually have a centralized system that actually helps us modulate between them? How do we share systems, especially if they're geographically co-located, like on a campus? Can we do that? And how do we optimize across different buildings? So if we have many buildings connected, can we actually use the buildings themselves actually as utilities for each other in some ways? And again, sometimes in some locations this can be hugely beneficial, and at other times it may be really a marginal thing. So we have to look at it very carefully to understand when these things actually are the most beneficial. Here's a community currently being built in the Aspen area of Colorado. It's some low income or kind of affordable housing that is being built through all electric community. A lot of very basic kinds of ideas of good insulation and heat pumps and so forth in order to have this community be essentially a net zero community. But the exciting part about this is it's also being looked at by Holy Cross Energy, and NREL is working on this as well. And they're going ahead and starting to understand how can these buildings actually work with the utility to kind of harmonize with the grid and have this optimized power flow. So they have batteries. The utility can actually go ahead and start to understand when your heat pump is going on or hot water, and allow you to sort of control some of these other things that are going on in the house. When do you want to charge your car? When do you want to, use these different things? And so there's a optimization that happens between the buildings and the utility. And Holy Cross feels like this is a really important part of them meeting their goals for getting to a 70% carbon-free grid by 2030. So pretty cool that they're actually investing in this and understanding that control system across these 20-some houses as an opportunity to sort of optimize the utility production. So another one that's pretty famous is this Peña Station near Denver, and they've got a much larger community. It's about 400, I think, acres and 100 buildings, a bunch of different residential and commercial buildings. They have a really large PV array, it's about 1 megawatt. They have a large battery storage, again, I guess about 2 megawatts. And one of the really cool things about what they've done here is, in addition to sort of the resilience and the climate things, is that they've been able to avoid putting in a substation at this end of the grid. So the resilience and the grid services that are provided by having the distributed energy resources, specifically the PV and the battery storage, allows them to operate this in many ways that kind of helps them kind of make the grid run more smoothly. So very, very nice kind of system. Mostly Panasonic, I guess, has built it out. And it's continuing to be built out and near the airport here in Denver. A last project that I want to show you here is Hazelwood Green. This is in Pittsburgh, and it's also in the process of being constructed. It's about 180 acres, mixed-use development. And really, some of the stuff here is pretty straightforward. We wanted to have renewable energy capacity and put in the sort of district ground source heat pumps, and got to these efficient buildings, and that was kind of the basic way to get to zero in this thing. But what we wanted to do is also to understand how all of these buildings could work together. So on one hand, we find like there's some buildings that are, have more roof area than load and produce more energy than they need. There are other ones that basically might be lab or multi-story buildings, and basically it's not possible for them to be independently net zero. So we can actually kind of move that energy across this 180 acre site and have these buildings kind of support each other. And also when there's extra energy, you can export it to the local community, and basically have all of this work together in a way that helps balance out energy on the site as well as in the community. The really interesting thing here is this integrated energy services provider model, which allows them to go ahead and have a cost-effective way of providing this for all of these different components. So the energy services provider has capital investments and provides thermal energy, grid interface, renewable energy, financing, and all of this, and basically shifts all those costs from the upfront to basically into a financing package that the central entity can handle. Similarly, all of the revenues that the IESP has go back through kind of the energy bills, and these actually are less than it would be in a typical building. So the net effect here is that we've got a net zero community that's cost effective to build and operate, and actually provides another sort of way of having income for this other entity, the integrated energy services provider. This is described more in this NREL publication, and so is Peña Station and a bunch of other great case studies. I definitely think you should download this when you have the chance. It's really critical, because when you start to think about the opportunities of grid interactive buildings. We know this is the critical decade to go ahead and get our carbon emissions back down to where they need to be. And it is something which we can do on an individual building level. There are those big duck curves that we need to adjust to, but we can also think about all of the other buildings. And if we add up all those little ducks, we can get to the place that we need to get to in terms of reducing our overall emissions. I'm also going to provide you with a bunch of resources, and these should be in the slides when Connie sends them out tomorrow. So thank you. Help these ducks to fly, and I'll turn it back over to Alexi for bring us home. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. So really interesting topics we've been talking about and hearing about here, from the single building scale to portfolios of single buildings to this district scale, like Victor was talking about here. I'm going to not necessarily shift gears, but I'm going to try to give you something you can work with, sink your teeth into, if you will. The Grid Optimal Buildings Initiative, which I've been leading and I'll describe in a moment, has released or has helped with USGBC to release a pilot credit. So now buildings can receive up to 3 LEED points for improving building grid harmonization outcomes, or GEB outcomes, if you like. So I'll describe how that LEED credit works, so that you as a designer or any other stakeholder can go get some LEED credits for this, as well as try to harvest some of those various benefits, right? Cost, emissions, occupant benefits, resiliency. So I'll just give you a quick overview on the Grid Optimal Buildings Initiative, and then I'll talk about this credit and how it works, and we'll leave plenty of time for discussion at the end here. Grid Optimal is a multi-year, multi-stakeholder open collaborative effort led by New Buildings Institute in partnership with US Green Building Council. The primary focus of Grid Optimal has been the creation of new metrics by which we can put a number on, we can quantify the quality of interactions between buildings and the electricity grid. And that means single buildings or groups of buildings. Those metrics are now published. You can see there's a link here to a blog and a peer-reviewed conference paper that describes the methodology, what goes in, what comes out, what are these things, how do they work, but I'll get into the metrics in a moment. And then as I just alluded to, those metrics form the core of this new LEED credit, the Grid Optimal Buildings Pilot Alternative Compliance Path, or ACP, which is published. You can see there's a link there where it says published and available for teams now. Our current work in Grid Optimal, we're on year 3 of a 3-year initiative. So we've got those metrics fully baked, and what we're doing now is deployment. And of course, getting that LEED credit out there is deployment, and we're also thinking about that from a couple other perspectives, developing utility program criteria so that energy efficiency programs, or so that utilities can use these metrics to get grid harmonization or GEB outcomes in their incentive and technical assistance programs for their customers. We're also putting together market-facing design guidance, so that should be coming out in the next few months here. And then using these metrics and this work, this body of work we've developed, us and our partners, to inform codes, policies, and standards. And thanks, of course, to the Grid Optimal sponsors you see on the right there. So here are these vaunted Grid Optimal metrics. There are 8 core metrics, 6 of which are directly used in the LEED pilot credit. I'm not going to read everything on this screen, but basically there are a couple of different types of, really 2 sort of categories of metrics. The first has to do with the load shape. So a building's load shape is its usage over time. On the x-axis here, you see the hours from 0 to, well, 23. So 24 hours in a day. And on the y-axis is the building's demand, the kilowatts flowing through the meter. This is an office building that we happen to be looking at. Lower usage in the nighttime, it ramps up 6, 7, 8 a.m. Then it's keeping pretty high throughout the day and starts dropping off in the evening, right? Pretty typical load shape. So some of the grid optimal metrics have to do with the building's load shape, also known as demand profile, and how that load shape compares with things on the other side of the meter. That could be the system peaks in the utility grid. So the grid peak contribution metric measures how peaky is the building when the grid is also peaky during peak hours on the grid. Or it could be things like carbon. How peaky is the building when the grid is relatively high carbon or relatively low carbon? How well aligned is this building's usage to the grid's the variability of grid carbon? And some of those charts that Rushil showed at the beginning there show how you can use this in a design context to think about building carbon emissions impacts. So these the first half of these metrics, if you like, these first four, have to do with the building's load shape versus conditions beyond the meter. And these are in large part able to capture or intended to capture the impacts of static or passive strategies, insulation, shading, permanent measures that you might take as a designer or might be present in a building, or operational strategies like HVAC schedules or controls that happen day in, day out. So they impact the load shape throughout days and throughout the year. There's another way you can think about this that is about the assets or the capabilities in the building. So what kinds of equipment or controllability of equipment is present in this building or in these buildings that can then change that load shape sort of at will, right? Can we turn the thermostats up and down? Can we control when we charge electric cars or batteries or so forth? So the capability or asset metrics mostly focus on demand flexibility, and there are a couple different flavors of demand flexibility measured in these metrics: short-term, long-term, and dispatchable. It has to do with who controls that flexibility. And then there's one about resiliency, which is about can the building safely island from the grid for different amounts of time, and then also can the building support resiliency at the grid scale by making sure that its motors are able to ramp up slowly rather than having every motor hit full power at once as soon as the power comes back on from an outage. So there are a couple different asset or capability metrics discussed as well. Within that LEED pilot ACP, the LEED credit, there are 3 points available, and there are a couple different ways that teams can go about doing that. You get your first point for just calculating and reporting. And the idea there is many designers are not really, I think a lot of the folks on this call have been thinking about these topics, and hopefully by the end of today's conversation, you've got some resources or some perspective or some frameworks that can help you apply this for those that are in that position. But many people out there in the world and many practitioners in the industry, this is not necessarily on their radar. So there is a point for run these things through. We have a spreadsheet calculator that can be downloaded from the USGBC website. It was linked in one of the slides above there. And you run your load shapes through, you answer a couple of very basic questions about building capabilities, and there you see your scores. You do this in a proposed case and in a baseline case and a proposed case, which is typical for a LEED process. And then you see how they changed over time. And the idea is do no worse from baseline to proposed, although there is a little wiggle room if one score happened to go down to discuss how that happened. And then you can get more than 1 point, one additional point, and then an innovation and design point as a sort of a bonus available. And there are 2 pathways to do that. One is across the board improvements, so make relatively small improvements in multiple categories of these grid optimal metrics that I just talked about above. It could be, grid peak contribution and demand flexibility, for instance. Or you can really drill down in one area and say, I'm going to just nail it on aligning my demand profiles with the carbon profile on the grid. We're going to really focus on grid carbon alignment. And then you can get your points by really focusing in on one and moving that ball farther down the field, if you like. So, like I said, this credit is available. It's up. I'm happy to answer questions about it or to discuss. We've been getting a couple of project inquiries recently, but I'd love to see more projects take this on and use it. And then I want to kind of zoom out a bit and say, okay, you know, regardless of that one pilot credit, that's great. Sure, please go ahead. But there are some considerations that are worth keeping in mind for both building design and for operation and for decision making throughout the design specification and operation of a building. There's kind of two basic things. The first is the grid context, and this varies over time. Victor talked about the duct curve. That is the duct curve is a California phenomenon, although there are ducts popping up in various places around the country, some places that maybe one wouldn't expect them to. So there's the duct curve is a California graph, but the duct phenomenon is present. But that's really a factor or a reflection of a relatively solar heavy grid. So California, for instance, has a fair amount of both utility scale and distributed PV panels. And those, of course, produce more energy during the middle of the day, especially in the summer. So you see that high production of PV that drives the net loads relatively low in the middle of the day. That's the belly of the duct. But then as the sun starts going down, those PV panels, of course, aren't producing as much in the later evening hours of the day and none at night. And so you now have the head of the duct where you have to use other resources to provide that power. So that's a solar heavy paradigm, but that's not the only paradigm. Texas and the Midwest, for example, are relatively wind heavy with onshore wind, which often blows stronger at night. So whereas in California, the grid is relatively clean at noon, may not be quite as clean at midnight or 10 p.m. or midnight. In Texas, the grid may be cleaner at night because that onshore wind is really blowing at night. Wind heavy grids also may have higher short-term variability because wind can blow and calm down at relatively short term. So the value of demand flexibility may be a little higher there. And then some places in the country, for example, where I am in the Pacific Northwest, have larger amounts of hydropower. So that has a high seasonal component where there's a lot of hydro cranking, flowing down those rivers, and the dams are really cranking in the spring and early summer when the snow is melting off the mountains. The hydro also provides good flexibility over the short term. It's relatively easy to turn dams up and down. That's a limited capability, but it's proved quite valuable for the Northwest. And then, of course, many parts of the country are and are expected to remain relatively heavy on fossil fuels. So there are, you may have pretty high carbon overnight baseload conditions, as well as expensive and dirty peaker plants that run during those peak hours, often summer evenings. Which brings me to the other piece that I want to cover, which is about the climate context, also quite relevant. So you can see there's both grid and climate, and they interplay with each other to send these inherent signals to buildings that are kind of driving this whole conversation. Most places across the continent, across North America, are summer peaking, where for the most part, that means hot summer afternoons are the highest load times on the grid. Those are often pretty high carbon as well. So focusing on strategies in the building that reduce demand during those warm summer afternoon times that's a good place to start. Thermal envelope upgrades, afternoon shading, getting a really good handle on internal loads, and enabling systems to do things like pre-cooling. And if you think about this, it may be, oh, am I in a summer peaking location that is solar heavy? Okay, I can use power at noon to pre-cool to avoid that summer peak, right? You can see how these both interplay a bit. There are not a whole lot of truly winter peaking regions around here. For the most part, you've got either summer peaking or dual peaking, but the winter peak is kind of useful to think about because, of course, a dual peak has both a summer and a winter peak. So there are some strategies there. Thermal envelope upgrades appears again, and then, of course, the heating system and now preheating to avoid contributing to system peaks and driving peaker plants to need to operate expensive, high carbon, to avoid the need for those to operate on cold winter mornings. Also, that's a resiliency benefit, as we have seen in some of these big winter storms as well, even in places you might not expect, like Texas. which kind of brings me to my next topic that I'll sort of close this out with, which is that we've been talking a lot about emissions and costs, and those are definitely important, critical, but it's also really important to keep in mind that the same features in a building that provide these emission savings and can drive these cost savings also can support resiliency goals. So in Grid Optimal, we do have an explicit metric around resiliency, but there are ways to enhance building resiliency and resiliency across multiple buildings and resiliency of the grid that look a lot like the ways that you can reduce carbon in a building, right? Passive features that reduce peak demand needs may also support the building's ability to coast when the power is out to enhance passive survivability, make it through these blackout times or these potential disaster times. So and I think in many cases, these are the drivers for decision making at the building scale. So it's important to think about co-optimizing the benefits. Can we get cost savings and emission savings and resiliency benefits and make sure that the indoor comfort and the indoor services that our building is providing to those tenants or those occupants are, as good as they can be? And then if we can do all of those things, then there are multiple drivers pushing for the same types of strategies in buildings. And I think that's when we're going to see a really large-scale adoption of these GEB strategies and these GEB practices. So the long-term vision that we're working for here through Grid Optimal, through these projects that our presenters have talked about today, is really to find ways to transform the built environment, the buildings we have today and the buildings we are building and will be building now, so that they can be active participants in the electricity grid and the energy system of tomorrow. We're thinking about this in terms of design, we're thinking about this in terms of utility programs, and want to provide really actionable resources like design guidance, which will be coming out, as I mentioned, pretty soon here for Grid Optimal, to make sure that the buildings that we have now and that we will have are not standing in the way of the energy transition, but that are actively helping to decarbonize both the building scale and the grid scale. And with that, I'll note we are welcoming more pilot buildings within Grid Optimal, so please join us if you're interested. I believe I will pass it to Connie. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to invite our panel to turn on their cameras for the Q&A part of our presentation. And just a reminder, we will be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the on-demand recording and a PDF of the slides that we used here today. Okay, I am going to go ahead and start with the questions. Let's see. Okay, can you explain more about the tie to IoT here?
I can jump into that because I mentioned IoT a number of times. Right now, I think there's so many sensors that are coming out and even equipment that have IoT technologies. So, and by saying IoT, I know that's a big umbrella term here, but it's really enabling wireless communications and wireless mesh networks to exist in buildings where specific technologies are tracking energy consumption and communicating it back to the building automation system. So the sense is just we have so much data now for so much of our equipment in our buildings that we can really offer these advanced analytics to control our buildings at a much more in a much more detailed manner, so that we can really address efficiency and demand flexibility, et cetera.
Okay, anybody have anything to add? All right, thank you, Rose.
I think Victor was.
I was just gonna, the mute button. I was just going to say that the Basalt Vista project is probably a good example of that, where you've got, control of water heaters and things that you normally wouldn't necessarily think of as part of your energy system, but being able to have a centralized control that, puts all of that stuff into the mix does help with the energy balancing and storage.
And it's almost, to some extent, putting those capabilities in equipment like the CTA 2045 compliant water heater, for example, or just a device that has the ability to communicate with the grid or take a signal from the grid. You can think of that as a form of future proofing. Even if there isn't a program in place right now to do that in your location, there may well be relatively soon or in the future. So being in a position to take advantage of that that's a good position to be in.
Yeah, and now I'm going to clarify one more thing too is, if specific equipment does have that ability to have the two-way communication, it can be utilized in multiple ways. So more how Alexi was saying, like the utility could actually provide that supervisory control over the equipment and turn things off. So in a residential setting, it could be water heaters, or it could be turning your dryer off for 15 minutes during the day when it's really needed by the utility. But in a commercial building, that could happen as well, but also thinking about other supervisory control that really helps to optimize the operation of the building. So that could be led by the facility manager or by the building owner investing in these software control solutions that then talk to that equipment. So there's kind of two levels of control that could happen.
Okay. Is that everybody? All right. This question's a little longer here. How do you design buildings and building operations to plan ahead for drastic change in the power sector? For example, in the Midwest, it may save building owner cost to shift load off peak, but the Midwest grid being coal powered, that'll change in the next 5 to 10 years. How do we plan for the flexibility with a wide range of future scenarios?
So I'll start quickly and then I'll let others jump in. Within Grid Optimal, we are looking at 2040. It's actually the average of the decade surrounding 2040. But 2040 grid total system peak situation and grid emissions factors. And the data set we're pulling from is from National Renewable Energy Lab. It's their standard scenarios output, and it's called the Cambium data set. So if you search NREL standard scenarios or NREL Cambium, that should pop right up, and you can get hourly forecasts every 2 years from 2020 to 2050 of system loads and carbon in various flavors. And there are a couple of cost flavors as well. It's a bit more grid cost than retail cost, but you can get an idea where things might be going, and those can be done at the state level or more granular than that as well. So that's a good resource to think about. In terms of which year should we think about? Should we design for right now, or should we design for later? That's an interesting question. And in some of our pilot projects, we've done both of those. We've said, well, here's what it looks like this year, and kind of like Rushu was doing, right? That here's the 2030 case, or here's the 2020 case, and here's the 2030 case. And Rushu, maybe you want to talk about that, because I thought that was really interesting what you're saying about staging the deployment of the solar plus storage system so that you're hitting those reduction targets over time.
Right, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, which is it doesn't necessarily have to be a static target that we're designing to, or a static system that we're designing. We have an understanding of, and that's kind of why the sensitivity analysis plays a role in identifying what a good design strategy is, which is it's not just a single thing that we're designing, but we're kind of trying to understand the full range of possibilities of the implications of what we're doing when we look at different profiles in different scenarios. But also the fact that we're looking at several years in advance, a lot of these systems are not necessarily going to last, or we're going to have to make some kinds of upgrades. So it's important to think of this as, well, for the next 10 years, maybe we can design a system that addresses some of the concerns that we have for the next 10 years, and then continue to upgrade or at least plan for additional capacity for some of these other systems. And greenhouse gas emissions and resilience don't really have to be at opposing ends. We can look at all of these as synergistic components and kind of design so that we can combine value streams. Makes it a lot easier from a design aspect.
And I'd like to add on to taking a step back, and especially in new construction and major renovation projects, we can do a lot with the base design of a building to really accommodate high performance operation. And on the resiliency side, thinking about what we call passive survivability. So really honing into the building envelope, making sure that it's well insulated, that it's airtight, that the windows are good, bringing in things like a thermal mass into the building that can maintain temperatures and float through extreme highs or extreme lows and provide that occupant comfort. Daylighting, so all of this can extend, and passive survivability is the operation of the building when you have an outage, so you can still provide these basic needs for the occupants moving forward for longer periods of time. And then you introduce the equipment and what types of equipment are really going to offer that flexibility on top of that, and including, of course, the PV and the batteries, which all of the considerations that Rushil was highlighting are really interesting to think about the timing of when we bring those into the project.
Yeah, this is a great conversation because, as Rose is saying, all of these efficiency ideas just they're winners, right? You should always do that. Just because you've got your building well connected to the grid doesn't mean that you want to add a big load, right? You want to do something that's kind of smart, and to the degree that your building can have that passive survivability is great. Now, I think the grid connection piece is about kind of us not knowing what to do next, because it gives you more kind of ideas and opportunities. There's that famous quote that the past is a lot easier to predict than the future. So, if you want to think about the future, what can you do to kind of increase your opportunities and options? And it's likely that the grid is going to get cleaner. It's likely that the grid is going to have more diverse energy sources, and the ability for your building to be able to adapt to that is going to be to your advantage. And I think in the future, some of the kind of grid services that we have a hard time sort of, basically making money off of today, whatever the frequency, harmonization and stuff like that, I think in the future is going to be much more valuable. And I think it's possible that buildings that have better connections, just like ecosystems that have more connections and have more ability to kind of connect into their environment, are going to be more valuable, and there'll be more opportunities to interact in a profitable way with our emerging utility infrastructure and ecosystem.
Okay. I have a question specifically for you, Victor, around your Connected Communities project. Could you describe the organization needed to centrally manage a group of GEBs in a connected community? Is there a need for a local utility to be created to manage and bill, or is this operated independent of the utility structure?
Yeah, so that's a great idea, and I have to say it's a question that keeps coming up. It's like, what's behind the meter? What's in front of the meter? Who owns what? Do I really want somebody else telling me to turn down my air conditioning or something? It's I don't know. It's a tough question with the U.S. culture, especially, I think. So we've got a bunch of different options, at least on the ones that I showed. The one out in Basalt is really run by the utility. So the utility is kind of the aggregator, as it were. In Peña Station, it was really more about the the company Panasonic and them setting up that. They work in partnership with Excel, and there's a fairly complicated partnership, as I understand how they've managed to share some of the ways that is run, but it's largely, again, utility driven. In Pittsburgh at Hazelwood Green, they're trying to set up an independent energy services provider, and that integrated energy services provider would be a sort of a third party that would negotiate between the utilities and the kind of developer / building owners. So that would be a different setup completely. And I think Rose mentioned that there's this FOA out for more connected communities and for description and enactment of these ideas. And there's a lot of different models out there. I'll just say there are ones that have to do with buildings being contiguous, as I mentioned, like a campus. There's non-contiguous things where people are just sending, signals over the internet to dispersed communities, or perhaps a portfolio of buildings that's by the same owner but has different locations. There's many ways of doing it, and I think people are very creative in this way. And I think the main thing is to have an aggregator that makes sense, both from a financial perspective as well as kind of a shared benefits perspective. Because it's really possible that some of these connected communities and GEBS things benefit really more one party than another. Utilities are often aggregators, utilities often benefit, but I think it can also be a kind of a shared savings type of approach where you've got different kinds of administrative frameworks that allow for more savings and understanding of, it may be, one party is more interested in sharing, saving money, and the other is more interested in saving carbon. These things need to be sort of balanced because it's a multi-factor optimization thing. You've got all these different things going on, and the structures that we set up to do that could be very complicated, or there's a number of different ways of doing it. Typically, right now, I think they are utility driven, but that by no means is the way that it needs to be.
That kind of leads me to a quick follow-up question to you, actually. You mentioned at Peña Station that one thing they managed to do was avoid having to build a new substation to serve that community, which, as you said, was pretty large, a large community. That is, a bunch of buildings and all kinds of resources. And is that a case of that value shared? Was the savings associated with not having to build the substation, was that able to pay for some of the GEB strategies, the solar plus storage, that kind of stuff? I don't know if maybe you don't know.
That's my understanding, is that to a large degree, not putting in the substation allowed for a lot more investment in especially the battery storage. Now, Rose, I don't know if you know any more about that. It's a story that's been going on for quite a while, but without a doubt, the avoided CapEx made the project go forward.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the details specifically on that project, on how that worked out or how the financing worked out, but I do know that that is a big concern for utilities. And they would love to defer these infrastructure costs that need to happen as we expand and grow with our buildings.
So sometimes that's like a real incentive to get these grid interactive buildings going, is finding places where the grid is particularly congested. Sometimes that's in the middle of cities. There's all kinds of things that are kind of constricting utilities in addition to the costs. And so that's, a really great aspect of the grid interactive approach.
Okay. We've had a number of questions about when you're turning off systems, what does that do to the air quality in the space, specifically thinking about COVID. So how does that, how does the comfort for the occupants work when you are turning off systems, and does it take long to bring them back up?
I'm going to jump in there because I know I mentioned staging air handling unit fans because that's directly related to COVID these days. And you know, I did mention that this really needs to be paired with occupancy. So there are a lot of software out there that do take in occupancy numbers, that do take in carbon dioxide numbers. And that's really where these advanced analytics can understand, you know, what portions of the building are truly being occupied and which ones are not. There's, you know, all of the load flexibility has to be within reason. We need to provide the services to the occupants, enough lighting for them to do their work, ventilation so that we're not transferring virus particles to one another, and that we're not getting sleepy at our desks either. So, you know, all of this is can we reduce our operations during certain times where occupants aren't there, or there's less occupants, but in reasonable manners that we're not really impacting how an occupant is working, or what tasks they might need to do in the building. So I think that's a really important note to make with all of this, is that we're not looking at doing anything extreme with these buildings, but we can operate them with that flexibility in ways that do have impacts to our demand charges on our utility bill. There's still a lot of opportunity there.
Okay, let's see. Alexi, this question is specifically for you. Is the Grid Optimal pilot credit available for Canadian projects at this time?
You know, so here's my understanding on that. I got a question recently from Japan as well. My understanding is that the pathway is available, but the data set from NREL standard scenarios doesn't extend to Canada. So if we can find a good data set that would have hourly grid system and carbon forecasts, then the methodology stands just as well here versus anywhere else. The challenge has been getting a consistent and solid data set to be able to make those predictions. That said, the demand profile metrics don't need any of that. That's all about the capabilities of the assets in the building. And my understanding is that those should be available regardless. So it may be that you don't have both pathways if we can't find a good data set for Canada, but you still do have the demand flexibility pathway. But feel free to send me an email or drop me a line somehow, and I'm happy to talk further about that. And if you do know of a good data set in Canada, great, let's put it in the Grid Optimal calculation spreadsheet for that pilot ACP.
Okay, all of you have provided great information about grid integrated buildings. Do you all have resources to find out more information about integrated grids? And I will say,
yeah, the Department of Energy has what they're calling, well, on the sidelines, the GEB site. So they do have a repository of a ton of resources that have been published recently on GEB. So I think if you just search Department of Energy Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings, it pops up at the top there. But we can provide a link after this as well.
Great, I'm happy to add it to our follow-up email as well, Rose.
Yeah, maybe we can add a slide in at the end of this, right around here at Q&A. So when folks get the slides after the webinar, and Victor's got a resources slide. The Grid Optimal website, of course, has several and links to more. So if everyone wants to just drop me a line with the presenters, drop me a line and I'll pull those together and we'll get them into the slide deck.
All right. Well, I think we're just about, I don't want to take any big questions and go over, and we just have another minute left. Any closing remarks from anybody or anything before we close out today? All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our presenters. This was fantastic. Make sure to fill out the survey if you are seeking AIA credits today, and you will get a follow-up email tomorrow with a copy of a participation certificate, as well as links to both the oh my goodness, the slides and the recording. Sorry, Alexi, go ahead and run through those.
No problem. I just wanted to let people know, please join us. Feel free to join us. We'd love to have you join us in late October in New York City in person, not kidding, for the Getting to Zero Forum, leading event about getting buildings to zero energy and zero carbon. And we have a whole set of presentations and conversations around this topic, building grid integration, as well as some other really exciting stuff. So hope to see you there. And here, of course, are some resources on the Getting to Zero Forum website resource hub. There are hundreds of resources that I think might be useful for people attending this. And here's a couple ways to keep in touch on what's happening with NBI. And with that, that is all. So thanks everybody for joining. To the presenters, thank you for your time, and everybody on the line, appreciate having you join us today. And let's take what we've learned today and use it to make buildings, help enable building, grid, and overall system transformation as we move into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.